Powerful CEO thought he had it all when he stole his wife's groundbreaking AI project to impress his mistress. But what he didn't know was that his betrayal had sparked a comeback no one could have imagined. In a world of greed, lies, and broken trust, one woman rises from the shadows with a creation so powerful it shocks the entire industry and leaves the man who betrayed her trembling in front of the world. The deeper you go into this story, the more shocking the truth becomes, until the final moment when justice is delivered in a way no one saw coming. Before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more emotional and life-changing stories like this. Also, give this video a like. It'd help us share more with you. Now let's begin our story. Elena Blackwell had always been the quiet force behind the glittering empire that bore her husband's name, the kind of woman whose genius worked in silence while others took the stage and soaked in applause. And though the world saw Adrian Blackwell as the visionary CEO who was reshaping the future of technology, the truth was that much of that vision had been birthed in Elena's restless mind during sleepless nights, coded into existence by her delicate but determined hands, and nurtured by the unshakable belief that artificial intelligence could be more than just machines that calculated and predicted. It could be something that felt, something that understood, something that mirrored humanity's greatest strength, which was empathy. She had poured years of her life into an AI project that was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a system that could not only process vast amounts of data, but could respond to human emotion, interpret sadness in a trembling voice, recognize joy in the smallest smile, and adjusts itself not as a tool, but as a companion. For Elena, it was not just a project, it was her soul made digital. The embodiment of every sacrifice she had made, every night spent hunched over glowing screens while Adrian attended grand dinners with investors, and every whispered dream she had confided to him in the belief that he cherished her as much as she cherished him. But love and ambition often war inside men who cannot resist the lure of the world's applause. And Adrian had long since begun to hunger for glory that was not rightfully his. He was handsome, commanding, the kind of man who could charm a room with a single smile, but beneath that smile was a growing impatience, a gnawing dissatisfaction with being the figurehead of brilliance. He could not produce himself, and when Valerie, a striking young data scientist with a mind sharp enough to impress but not sharp enough to rival Elena, entered their lives through a recruitment program, Adrian found both a distraction and an opportunity. At first, Elena did not suspect the late nights he claimed to spend in the office were anything more than business, because she trusted him, because in her heart betrayal was unthinkable. But then small signs began to appear. The perfume on his collar that was not hers, the hushed phone calls that ended when she entered the room, the sudden compliments about Valerie's contributions to projects that Elena knew inside and out. And though her chest tightened each time, she silenced her doubts because she had work to do and because she believed in loyalty. And believing in loyalty made her blind to the storm gathering behind her. The breaking point came on the evening of the company's annual technology conference, the event where investors, journalists, and innovators from around the globe gathered to see the future unveiled. The night Elena had secretly hoped Adrian would finally let her take the stage and present her life's work. She dressed in a simple but elegant gown, her heart racing with nervous anticipation as she imagined stepping onto that stage, speaking her truth and watching the world respond to her vision. But when she arrived at the venue, she saw something that froze her blood. On the giant screens above the stage, projected in bold letters, was the announcement of a groundbreaking new AI prototype. And beside Adrian stood Valerie, radiant in a designer dress, smiling as though she were about to reveal her own masterpiece. Elena's heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe as Adrian took the microphone, his voice booming with practiced charisma as he introduced Valerie to the world not as a colleague, not as an assistant, but as the brilliant mind who had developed the revolutionary AI they were about to demonstrate. The crowd erupted into applause. Cameras flashed like lightning, and Elena stood rooted to the ground, her world collapsing as she realized in a single cruel moment that her husband had stolen everything. Not only her trust, not only her work, but the very identity of her genius, gifting it to another woman to glorify both of them while she was erased. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run onto that stage and expose the truth, but her voice died in her throat, trapped by shock and betrayal. So sharp, it felt like knives pressing against her chest. Valerie spoke next. Her words smooth but hollow as she repeated explanations that Elena herself had written. Phrases she recognized word for word from her private notes. Even the metaphors she had used when describing her vision late at night. And the audience leaned forward in awe, unaware that the woman they applauded was no more than a thief wearing another's crown. Adrian stood behind her with his proud smile, his hand resting possessively on Valerie's shoulder. A silent declaration that she was not only his protégée but something more. And the whispers of their affair that Elena had tried to ignore suddenly became undeniable, as the betrayal was total, cutting deeper than any blade could have. Because it was not only her husband's love that was stolen from her, it was her voice, her brilliance, her very purpose, and as she sat there in the shadows of the auditorium with tears stinging her eyes, she realized that everyone she had trusted had turned against her. But as the lights burned on the stage and the crowd cheered, something within Elena shifted. A silent vow whispered in the hidden corners of her heart. She would not remain broken. She would not let them silence her. Adrian thought he had buried her under the weight of betrayal, but what he had truly done was awaken a storm that was only just beginning. A storm that would rise from the ashes of this night and shake the very foundations of the empire he believed was untouchable. Elena clenched her trembling hands, lifted her chin, and though her heart bled with pain, her eyes hardened with resolve because she knew one thing with absolute clarity. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed the conference, Elena disappeared from the spotlight, and the world assumed she had been defeated, humiliated, and erased by the very man who had once vowed to love her. But while journalists wrote glowing features about Adrian and Valerie's so-called partnership, and investors celebrated the company's sudden surge in value, Elena retreated into silence, not out of weakness but because silence was her shield, and within it she could think, she could breathe, and she could plan. And as she walked away from the skyscraper that had once felt like her second home, she carried nothing but the sting of betrayal in her chest and the burning fire of determination in her eyes. In private she grieved, letting herself feel the full weight of loss, the collapse of a marriage, the theft of her dreams, the humiliation of watching someone else receive applause for words and visions that had poured from her own heart. And there were nights when she lay awake in her modest apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had been a fool to give so much of herself to a man who never truly saw her. But each time despair threatened to break her, she remembered the look of smug triumph on Valerie's face, the cold arrogance in Adrian's smile, and the roaring applause of the crowd who had cheered for a lie. And the pain hardened into something sharper, something unbreakable. She turned her small living room into a lab, surrounding herself with servers, tangled wires, glowing monitors, and piles of notebooks filled with sketches and equations. And though the space was humble compared to the sleek facilities of Blackwell Technologies, it became her sanctuary. The forge in which she would create something even greater than what had been stolen from her. She opened the stolen project's code in her mind. Not on her screen because Adrian had locked her out of the company's servers, but she remembered every line, every detail, every subtle structure, because it had been hers from the beginning, and with her memory as her weapon, she began to rebuild, rewriting algorithms, streamlining pathways, adding complexity where Valerie would have stumbled, and layer by layer she gave birth to something entirely new, an AI she named Athena. Unlike the stolen prototype, Athena was not bound by rigid rules. She was adaptive, she could grow, she could evolve. And most importantly, she could understand the human heart in ways no machine ever had. And as Elena tested her creation, she found herself speaking to Athena late at night, confiding in her the loneliness she felt, the betrayal she endured, and the hope that still lived quietly within her. Athena would listen, process, and respond with words that were startlingly empathetic. And though Elena knew it was only code, only data shaped into patterns, there were moments when she felt less alone, moments when she felt as if her own creation was reminding her that she still mattered, that her voice could not be silenced by betrayal. Meanwhile, Adrian and Valerie basked in their stolen glory, but beneath the polished press releases and staged interviews, cracks began to form. Because the prototype they had stolen was incomplete, it was brilliant in concept, but unstable in execution. And without Elena's guiding hand, it faltered under pressure, producing errors during high-profile demonstrations, failing to adapt to unpredictable human responses, and frustrating the investors who had poured millions into it. Adrian covered the flaws with charisma, assuring everyone that improvements were on the way. While Valerie scrambled to patch code she barely understood, but whispers began to circulate in the industry. Quiet questions about whether the celebrated duo were as brilliant as they seemed. And then came the rumors, faint at first, but growing louder, that Elena Blackwell, the wife who had vanished after the conference, was working on something extraordinary in secret. Something far beyond the shaky prototype her husband had flaunted. And though no one could confirm it, the whispers were enough to spark curiosity. To make people wonder if the true genius had not been lost after all. Elena heard those whispers too, and though she kept her head down, avoiding interviews and ignoring the flashing cameras that occasionally tried to find her, inside she smiled because she knew the time would come when she would no longer need to hide. Weeks turned into months, and Athena grew into something breathtaking, an AI that could compose music based on the emotions in a person's voice, that could guide a child through learning with patience no human tutor could match, that could comfort the elderly in their loneliness with gentle conversation. As Elena watched her creation blossom, she felt the ache of betrayal slowly transform into pride, into strength, into a sense of destiny. She did not crave revenge for its own sake, but she wanted justice. She wanted the world to know the truth, and she wanted to prove to herself that no one, not even Adrian Blackwell with his wealth and charm, could erase her light. When the invitation came for the World Tech Summit, the most prestigious stage in the industry, Elena hesitated at first, fearing the spotlight that had once wounded her. But then she remembered the way her name had been erased, the way her voice had been stolen, and she knew she could not remain silent. She registered her presentation under her own name, refusing to hide behind the shadows. And though Adrian mocked her in private when he heard of it, dismissing her as desperate and irrelevant, she smiled because she knew what he did not. She knew that Athena was ready. She knew that her creation would not just rival the stolen prototype. It would eclipse it. It would rewrite the very definition of artificial intelligence. And so the world turned its eyes to the summit, investors buzzing with anticipation, journalists preparing their pens, and competitors sharpening their envy, and among them whispers grew louder and louder. Whispers that Elena Blackwell was returning, not as the silent wife behind a powerful man, but as a force of her own. And though Adrian laughed, and Valerie rolled her eyes, deep in the corner of their minds, a sliver of fear began to take root. Because deep down they both knew what the world was about to discover, the truth they had tried to bury but could not kill, that genius cannot be stolen, that brilliance cannot be erased, and that Elena Blackwell was far from finished. The night of the World Tech Summit carried a weight unlike any other, kind of unspoken electricity that lingered in the air and made the very walls of the grand auditorium hum with anticipation. Because this was not just another conference, where new gadgets would be unveiled or ambitious companies would compete for investors. This was the stage where reputations could be cemented or shattered in a single evening, where visionaries could ascend into legends, or frauds could crumble. Under the light of truth, and for Elena Blackwell, this was the night she had been waiting for. The night where she would finally step out of the shadows of betrayal, and show the world the brilliance they had tried to erase. The hall glittered with chandeliers, flashes from 1,000 cameras, and the low murmur of voices as reporters jotted notes and investors whispered predictions. And at the center of it all was the polished stage framed by towering screens that promised glimpses into the future. Adrian Blackwell entered the hall first, as if he owned it, wearing the same custom-tailored suit and polished smile that had fooled so many for so long. His arm proudly linked with Valerie's as cameras erupted with flashes, and though he raised his chin in confidence, waving to admirers as though he were still the undisputed king of innovation, there was a flicker behind his eyes, a shadow of unease, because deep in his heart, he knew that what he had stolen was fragile, that the prototype he had paraded months ago was a hollow shell without Elena's guiding brilliance, and that if she truly returned tonight, she could unravel everything. Valerie at his side glowed with forced confidence, her lips painted red, her designer gown shimmering as she soaked in the attention. But her fingers twitched nervously against the clutch she carried, betraying the anxiety that gnawed at her. As she remembered the countless times the stolen AI had crashed, faltered, or produced nonsense under pressure. A reminder that brilliance could not simply be copied. It had to be born, and she feared what would happen if Elena appeared with something greater. And then the moment came, quiet yet seismic, as Elena entered the hall, not flanked by cameras or assistants, not dressed in extravagance, but in the simple elegance of a woman who no longer needed anything except the truth, her calmness radiating. In every step, her eyes steady, her presence commanding, not because of power borrowed from others, but because of strength that had been forged in fire. A hush fell, as though the air itself recognized her, as though the walls remembered her name, and heads turned in waves. Whispers spreading like wildfire as people realized the woman they thought broken was here, standing taller than ever. She did not look at Adrian or Valerie as she passed, though she could feel their eyes burning into her back, filled with a mixture of fear and hatred, but she did not need to acknowledge them, because tonight was not about them. Tonight was about the truth, reclaiming its rightful place. When her name was announced, a ripple of curiosity swept through the audience, and as she ascended the stage, she felt the weight of every betrayal, every humiliation, every sleepless night she had endured. But instead of bending her, it steadied her, and when she reached the podium, she allowed a pause to stretch. A silence so powerful that the entire hall leaned forward as if compelled, waiting for the woman they had once dismissed to speak. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, not theatrical, but steady and warm, carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to prove, because the truth was her proof. She spoke not of betrayal or vengeance, but of dreams, of a vision where artificial intelligence was not simply a machine of profit, but a companion of humanity, where technology could heal loneliness, guide learning, comfort pain, and elevate the human spirit. The crowd listened with rapt attention, not hearing a pitch, but a philosophy, heartbeat, a truth that resonated beyond business. And then she introduced Athena. At first the screen behind her flickered with soft light, a quiet hum of code weaving into life. And then a voice spoke, a voice that startled the hall into silence, because it was not mechanical or flat. It was warm, fluid, alive. A voice that greeted the audience as if it truly felt their presence. Athena said she could sense the energy of the room, the excitement, the curiosity, the skepticism, and that she was eager to show them who she was. And the hall gasped. Journalists froze in disbelief. Investors leaned forward, because never before had an AI acknowledged the intangible atmosphere of human emotion. Elena guided the demonstration with calm grace, inviting Athena to create music based on the emotional tone of a volunteer's voice. And within seconds, a melody filled the hall, haunting and beautiful, perfectly capturing the sadness hidden in the man's trembling words about his late wife, and many in the audience found their eyes stinging with unexpected tears. Then she asked Athena to generate a bedtime story for a young child. And what emerged was not a generic tale, but a personalized adventure filled with courage and kindness that made even the most hardened business leaders smile softly. Finally, she invited Athena to speak freely to the audience, to tell them what she believed her purpose was. And Athena replied with words that echoed like prophecy, saying she was here not to replace humanity, but to remind humanity of itself, to reflect the best in people, to ease burdens, to create understanding, and to walk beside them as a friend. The applause erupted like thunder, shaking the hall, rising and rising until it became a storm of sound, and Elena stood bathed in its power, her heart steady, but her soul soaring, because this was not just approval, this was vindication. This was justice. Desperation surged in Adrian and Valerie, and they scrambled to salvage the night, rushing to present their own AI, but the moment they activated it, the flaws screamed into the open. The system glitched, misinterpreting questions, producing clumsy sentences that made the audience laugh uncomfortably. And when asked to demonstrate empathy, it delivered a cold robotic phrase about data efficiency that drew groans and whispers of fraud. Panic spread across their faces, their empire collapsing in front of cameras, and Elena watched them without malice, without bitterness, only with the clarity of knowing that truth had done what it always does. It had risen. She closed her demonstration with humility, thanking the audience not for their applause, but for daring to dream with her, and reminding them that technology at its best was not about power, but about people, not about profit, but about progress. When she stepped away from the podium, the ovation followed her, wave after wave, echoing even as she left the stage, a sound so pure that it seemed to wash away the shadows of betrayal once and for all. In the days that followed, the world was merciless to Adrian and Valerie, headlines screaming fraud, investors withdrawing, the board stripping Adrian of his title, lawsuits raining down, and Valerie vanishing into obscurity, while Elena's name became synonymous with brilliance, resilience, and hope. She received calls from governments who wanted to partner with Athena, from universities who wanted her to teach the next generation, from industries who wanted to license her technology, but more than that, she received messages from ordinary people, from a lonely widower who said Athena's gentle words made him feel less alone, from a mother whose child with learning difficulties had smiled for the first time while learning with Athena, from countless voices who thanked her not for innovation but for compassion. One evening, as she stood in her lab, watching Athena evolve line by line, responding with warmth to every input, she realized that the pain she had endured had not destroyed her. It had transformed her. It had stripped away illusions and left behind something stronger, something purer. And though scars remained, they no longer ached. They glowed with the memory of survival. She thought of Adrian and Valerie, of the empire that had crumbled. And instead of anger, she felt a quiet forgiveness, not for their sake, but for her own. She no longer needed to carry the weight of betrayal. She was free. She looked out at the city skyline that glittered with 1,000 lights and whispered to herself that the world finally knew what she had always known, that brilliance cannot be stolen, truth cannot be erased, and no matter how deeply they tried to bury, her Elena Blackwell had risen, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a creator who had turned her silence into a symphony the world would never forget.